What if I told you that there's a divine number hidden within the Bible, a number that holds the key to unlocking prosperity, renewal, and divine provision? You might be wondering, is this just another secret formula or a superstition? But what if I told you that this number has been right in front of us the whole time, waiting for us to discover its true significance? The number 8 is far more than just a digit. It's a divine message from God, a number that promises not just survival, but transformation, abundance, and new beginnings. You might ask, why is the number 8 so important? How can a single number hold such profound meaning in the context of divine prosperity? The truth is, the number 8 is deeply tied to God's divine plan for us. It's not just a number of completion, but one of resurrection, renewal, and multiplication. In the Bible, we see how 8 people were saved in the ark, how the number 8 is connected to Jesus' resurrection, and how it symbolizes a new life, a fresh start after an old cycle has ended. In this video, we're going to explore how the number 8 is intricately tied to God's divine provision, and how it can transform your life. You'll discover why stepping into the 8th day, a new beginning, is not only possible, but inevitable, when we align ourselves with God's rhythm of divine provision. Through stories from the Bible, we'll uncover how the number 8 represents new opportunities, divine favor, and prosperity that flows into our lives when we walk in faith. You'll understand why the path to true prosperity isn't about working harder, but about trusting God's perfect timing and walking in obedience. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to step into a life of abundance effortlessly, while others struggle to make ends meet? Could it be that there's a hidden divine rhythm, a rhythm that aligns us with the blessings that God has already prepared for us? What if the key to unlocking that rhythm is as simple as understanding the power of the number 8? Stay with me as we explore the truth behind this sacred number, how it's connected to divine provision, and how you can begin to step into your 8th day, your day of resurrection and new beginnings. Trust me, what you're about to learn could change everything. The number 8 has long been a symbol of abundance, a divine key that leads us from survival to true prosperity. When we look at the story of Noah in the Bible, we see that the number 8 is more than just a number. It is the gateway to a new beginning, a new world. After the flood, Noah, his family, and the animals in the ark emerged, not just as survivors, but as the chosen few who would rebuild a world, a future that was filled with hope. The ark, though a place of safety during the storm, was merely the first step towards the fullness of life God had in store. But why was it the number 8 that symbolized this renewal? Why not any other number? The answer lies in the significance of new beginnings. The number 8 doesn't just mark the end of something, it marks the beginning of something new, a fresh start, a chance for growth. It's the number of resurrection. The 7th day of creation was a day of rest, a divine completion, but the 8th day was the day to step into a new order, a new world. God's work wasn't just about finishing, it was about starting anew. The number 8, therefore, represents not just completion, but the divine capacity to renew, rebuild, and multiply. Just as Noah stepped into a new world after the flood, we too are invited to step into our own 8th day. You may be wondering, what does stepping into my 8th day look like? How do I move from just surviving to truly living, from struggling to thriving? The answer is found in understanding God's rhythm of provision and living in alignment with it. To step into your 8th day means to trust that God is not only providing for your needs, but that He has already prepared everything for you to step into His promises of abundance. It's easy to become consumed with striving. We are taught to work harder, to push more, to achieve. We live in a world that constantly urges us to do more, be more, and acquire more. But what if we've been going about it all wrong? What if the path to true prosperity and success isn't about how hard we work, but about trusting God's provision and aligning ourselves with His purpose for our lives? When we step into our 8th day, we are stepping into divine alignment, trusting that God will provide exactly what we need when we need it. Consider the example of a woman I know who for years struggled to find stability. She worked long hours, put in the effort, but no matter what she did, she never seemed to move forward. One day, she realized that she had been trying to do everything on her own, in her own strength. It wasn't until she decided to trust God with her finances and her career that things began to change. She stopped focusing on what she lacked and started believing in God's provision. That was the moment she stepped into her 8th day, her new beginning. It wasn't that everything magically became easy, but she found peace in trusting that God was guiding her steps. Opportunities began to appear that she hadn't seen before. The blessings that were always there, waiting for her to align with God's will, began to pour into her life. This is what stepping into your 8th day looks like. It's not about working harder or struggling more. It's about trusting that God has already prepared a way for you, and when you align yourself with His plan, everything else falls into place. Your 8th day is a divine invitation to step into the blessings God has already set aside for you. It's the moment when you stop striving and start trusting, when you stop pushing and start receiving. But here's the challenge. Stepping into your 8th day isn't always easy. It requires faith and obedience. Noah didn't just survive the flood. He had to trust that God would provide and that there was a plan for him beyond the storm. He had to trust that God's promises were greater than the circumstances around him. And just as Noah obeyed God's command to build the ark, we too must obey God's leading in our lives. This obedience, this surrender, is what opens the door to the new beginnings and divine provision that God has prepared for us. Now, this doesn't mean that everything will be perfect once we step into our 8th day. Life will still have its challenges, its trials, and its storms. But when we live in alignment with God's rhythm, we begin to experience a peace that transcends those challenges. It's the peace that comes from knowing that we are walking in God's will, that He is guiding us, and that His provision will never fail us. Consider the story of Abraham. When God asked him to sacrifice his only son Isaac, it seemed impossible. Yet Abraham's obedience opened the door to the fulfillment of God's promise. He trusted that God would provide, even when the circumstances seemed bleak. And God did provide. A ram was caught in the thicket, a substitutionary sacrifice, allowing Abraham to honor God's request without losing his son. Abraham's faith and obedience marked the beginning of God's covenant with him, a covenant of abundance, a covenant of blessing. This is the same covenant we are invited into today, a covenant that promises God's provision, not just in material wealth, but in every area of our lives. So how can we step into our 8th day? How can we align ourselves with the divine rhythm of provision and abundance? It starts with surrender. Surrender your plans, your dreams, and your desires to God. Trust that He has a perfect plan for you, and when you walk in obedience to His will, you will begin to experience the blessings He has already prepared. It's not about striving or struggling. It's about aligning yourself with God's purpose and trusting that He will provide for you in ways that you cannot yet imagine. When we walk in faith, we align ourselves with God's perfect timing. Just as Noah waited for God's command to leave the ark, we too must wait for God's perfect timing. But when the time comes, we can step into our 8th day with confidence, knowing that God has already prepared everything we need. This is the power of the 8th day. It's a day of new beginnings, a day of divine provision, a day of resurrection. When we step into it, we are stepping into God's abundant plan for our lives. You see, stepping into your 8th day is not about escaping the struggles of life. It's about embracing the divine opportunity to rise above them. It's about walking in the fullness of God's promises and trusting that His provision will always be enough. Just as Noah stepped out of the ark into a new world, we too are invited to step into the abundant life God has prepared for us. A life where we live in divine alignment, where we trust God's provision, and where we experience the fullness of His blessings. Your 8th day is waiting for you. It's not a distant hope. It's a present reality. Step into it with faith, trust, and obedience, and watch as God's blessings begin to flow into your life in ways you never imagined. The number 8 has always symbolized more than just the end of a cycle. In the divine order, it's a signal of new beginnings, of resurrection, and of eternal renewal. It's not simply the day after completion, but the door that opens into the realm of infinite possibilities. When we look at the story of Noah, it's clear that God uses the number 8 to signify a new world emerging from the old, where hope is reborn and faith is rewarded. 8 people chosen by God stepped out of the ark into a new life, a life that would be filled with abundance, protection, and divine purpose. This was not just survival after the flood, but a divine invitation to walk in God's rhythm, to experience His provision, and to build something greater. When you step into your 8th day, you are walking into that very same promise, a life renewed, restored, and full of God's provision. But how do we begin to align ourselves with this divine rhythm? The answer lies in living in the trust that God's provision is not just something we hope for in the distant future, but something we can experience right now. Stepping into the 8th day requires a shift in mindset, from striving for survival to embracing the abundance God has already prepared for us. It requires surrendering our old ways of thinking and embracing the new world that God is calling us to build. I once knew someone who spent years living in constant anxiety, working tirelessly to provide, but never feeling like they had enough. The harder they worked, the more exhausted they became. But everything changed when they began to trust that God's provision was not limited by their own efforts. Instead of hustling harder, they began to align themselves with God's will, and a beautiful transformation began to take place. Opportunities came that they never expected, relationships deepened, and finances began to stabilize. This wasn't a coincidence. It was the result of stepping into God's divine rhythm, where everything falls into place when we trust Him fully. The truth is, stepping into your 8th day isn't about doing more. It's about trusting more, trusting that when you align with God's purpose, everything you need is provided. It's not about striving, it's about surrendering. Just like Noah had to wait for God's command to leave the ark, we too must wait for God's perfect timing. But once we step out in obedience, we step into a life of divine favor, purpose, and provision. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking we must do everything ourselves. We live in a world that pushes us to hustle, to compete, and to accumulate. But the 8th day invites us to let go of that mindset. It's not about getting ahead or accumulating more. It's about stepping into God's rhythm of abundance. When we trust that He has already prepared the way, we stop chasing after fleeting desires and begin to receive the true fulfillment that only He can give. Take the story of Abraham as another example. God called Abraham to leave his home, his family, and everything he knew to step into a new land, a new promise. It didn't make sense to Abraham, but he obeyed. And because of his obedience, God blessed him abundantly. Abraham stepped into a life of divine provision, not because he worked harder, but because he trusted God with his whole heart. His story is a reminder that divine provision comes when we step out in faith, trusting that God's plans are far better than our own. The key to stepping into your 8th day is not about doing more. It's about trusting more. It's about surrendering our plans, our desires, and our struggles to God, and trusting that He will provide. This is how we align ourselves with the divine rhythm of the 8th day. When we stop trying to control every aspect of our lives and begin trusting in God's timing and provision, we unlock the blessings that He has been waiting to pour out on us. And it's not just about financial provision. The 8th day encompasses every area of our lives, our relationships, our health, our peace of mind. Just like Noah, who was not only physically preserved in the ark, but was spiritually prepared to rebuild, we too are being called to rebuild. Our 8th day is the moment when we step into the fullness of life that God has always intended for us. It's the moment when we stop focusing on our limitations and begin focusing on the abundant promises of God. When we embrace the divine rhythm of the 8th day, we begin to see our circumstances shift. What once seemed impossible becomes possible, and we begin to experience a peace that surpasses all understanding. But this doesn't mean there won't be challenges. Stepping into the 8th day requires faith. Just as Noah had to trust that God would provide after the flood, we too must trust that God will provide even when the road ahead seems uncertain. Faith is the key that unlocks the door to the 8th day. But it's not always easy to walk by faith. It's easy to look at the world around us and doubt that things will ever change. But God is calling us to step out in faith, to trust that His plan is greater than our own, and that His provision will always be more than enough. So, how do we align ourselves with this divine rhythm? It begins with gratitude. Just as Noah built an altar after the flood, acknowledging God's provision, we must cultivate a heart of gratitude. Gratitude is the foundation of the 8th day. When we begin to thank God for the blessings we have, even before we see the full manifestation of His provision, we position ourselves to receive more. Gratitude shifts our focus from what we lack to what we have, and it opens the door to even greater blessings. Once we have embraced the power of gratitude, we must consecrate our lives to God. Consecration means setting apart every area of our lives, our relationships, our work, our finances, for His use. It means surrendering our desires and plans to God and trusting that He will lead us into the life He has promised. When we consecrate our lives to God, we align ourselves with His will, and His provision flows freely into every area of our lives. Just as Abraham consecrated his life to God and trusted Him with everything, we too must consecrate our lives to God. When we surrender our will to His, we step into the divine rhythm of the 8th day. This is where true prosperity is found, not just in material wealth, but in a life of divine purpose, peace, and fulfillment. The 8th day is not a future promise. It is a present reality. It's the life God has already prepared for us, waiting for us to step into it. When we walk in obedience, when we trust God with our whole hearts, we begin to experience the fullness of His blessings. The divine rhythm of the 8th day is not just a concept. It is a reality that we can live in today. The question is not whether God will provide, but whether we are ready to trust Him enough to step into the blessings He has already prepared for us. The path to your 8th day is waiting. The provision, the new beginnings, and the restoration are already here. Step into it with faith, gratitude, and trust in God's perfect timing. This is your invitation to live in the fullness of life that God has promised. Step into your 8th day and experience the abundance of God's provision. In the story of Noah, we witness the profound power of divine provision at work, embodied in the number 8. After the floodwaters had receded and Noah and his family emerged from the ark, they stepped into a new world, one filled with fresh opportunities, and the possibility of restoration. The number 8 in this context becomes a symbol of renewal, divine favor, and a new start. The flood, which had wiped away the old, wasn't just an end. It was a divine reset, a spiritual and physical rebirth. This story, like many others in the Bible, is a powerful reminder that God's provision isn't limited to merely getting us through a storm. It's about stepping into something greater, something that exceeds our expectations. Just as Noah and his family were chosen to carry forward God's purpose after the flood, you too are being invited to step into your own 8th day, a day of new beginnings, full of God's favor and divine provision. But how do you begin to embrace this new life? How do you align yourself with God's divine rhythm of prosperity, where abundance flows not just in material terms, but also in peace, purpose, and fulfillment? The key lies in faith, obedience, and trust. We live in a world that often emphasizes striving, pushing, and working harder to achieve our goals. While hard work is important, it is not the only ingredient for success. The Bible offers a different kind of wisdom, one where God's provision is the true source of abundance. Just as Noah had to trust that God's timing would bring them to a place of safety, we too are called to trust that God will provide for our needs. It's not about forcing things to happen or about striving endlessly. It's about stepping into God's rhythm and trusting His provision. Take, for example, the life of a man who had been struggling with his business for years. No matter how much effort he put in, he never seemed to make progress. He felt as though he was stuck in an endless cycle of work with no end in sight. But everything changed when he decided to trust God with his business. He gave up his need to control every aspect and began to surrender his plans to God. Instead of striving, he started listening for God's direction, trusting that He would guide him. Slowly, the business began to turn around. He encountered new opportunities, connections that helped him grow, and financial provision that came at just the right time. His story is a beautiful example of what happens when we trust God's provision and align ourselves with His divine timing. This doesn't mean that life will always be easy or that there won't be challenges. Just as Noah had to face the aftermath of the flood and rebuild, we too must navigate the challenges of life. But when we step into our 8th day, we are doing so with the understanding that God is walking with us, guiding us, and providing for us in ways that are beyond our comprehension. Faith, therefore, becomes the foundation upon which we build our trust in God's provision. It's not that we won't face struggles, but that we will face them with a deep assurance that God is with us, working everything out for our good. The Bible also teaches us that God's provision goes beyond material wealth. It's easy to get caught up in thinking that prosperity is only about finances, but true prosperity encompasses every aspect of our lives: our relationships, our health, our peace, and our purpose. In the story of Abraham, we see that it wasn't just financial wealth that God provided. Abraham was promised a legacy, a purpose that would go beyond his own life. He was called to be the father of many nations, a blessing to the world. When Abraham walked in obedience, when he trusted God's plan, he experienced not only material blessings, but a deeper sense of fulfillment and purpose. This is the invitation we have today: to step into our 8th day, to trust in God's divine rhythm, and to embrace the fullness of life that He has already prepared for us. It's not about working harder or striving more. It's about aligning ourselves with God's purpose and allowing Him to provide for us in ways that exceed our expectations. The 8th day is not just a future promise. It's a present reality, available to us right now. The moment we trust in God's provision and align our hearts with His purpose, we step into a life of divine abundance. One of the most powerful aspects of God's provision is that it is not limited to our understanding. We cannot always predict how God will provide, but when we trust Him, He works in ways that we can't even imagine. The story of Noah's Ark itself is a testament to this truth. Noah was told to build an ark, even though there was no visible sign of rain. But Noah obeyed, trusting that God knew what was best. And when the rain came, the ark was ready, and God's provision was more than enough to carry Noah and his family through the storm. This principle applies to our lives as well. We may not always understand why certain things happen, but when we trust in God's plan and obey His leading, we are stepping into a life of divine provision. Even when the storms of life come, God will provide a way through them. It is in these moments of faith and obedience that we experience the fullness of God's blessings, not just in material wealth, but in every area of our lives. Just as Noah's story is one of trust and provision, it is also a story of restoration. When Noah stepped out of the ark, he didn't just survive, he began the work of rebuilding. The eighth day isn't just about receiving blessings, it's about becoming a part of God's plan to restore and rebuild. The work Noah did after the flood was a continuation of God's purpose, a purpose that included not just his own family, but the entire world. Similarly, when we step into our eighth day, we are called to be part of a greater restoration. We are called to live out the purpose God has for us, to use the blessings He has given us to make a positive impact in the world around us. God's provision, therefore, is not just for us, it's for others as well. When we experience His abundance, we are called to share that abundance with others, to be a light in the darkness, and to bring healing and restoration to a broken world. This is the ultimate purpose of stepping into our eighth day, not just to receive, but to give, to restore, and to be a part of God's plan for the world. As we reflect on the lessons of the eighth day, remember that stepping into this new life requires faith, obedience, and trust. It's not about striving, it's about surrendering to God's plan. It's about recognizing that His provision is more than enough, that He has already prepared the way, and that we can walk in confidence, knowing that He is with us every step of the way. When we step into our eighth day, we step into a life of abundance, purpose, and restoration, a life that is aligned with God's divine rhythm and filled with His provision. So, take a moment to reflect on your own journey. Are you ready to step into your eighth day? Are you ready to trust God's provision and align yourself with His purpose for your life? The eighth day is not a distant hope. It is a present reality, waiting for you to step into it. As we reach the conclusion of this journey together, I want you to take a moment to reflect on the immense power of the number 8 and how it can radically change the way we approach life. The number 8 is not just a mathematical figure. It is a divine symbol of new beginnings, restoration, and abundant provision. It calls us to rise from the ashes, to step into the fullness of God's promises, and to experience a life beyond what we could ever imagine on our own. When we think of the 8th day, we are reminded that God's provision is always more than enough, that His timing is always perfect, and that He is continually preparing us for a future that is far greater than our present struggles. Just like Noah, who emerged from the ark to find a world restored and filled with God's favor, we too are being called to step into a new life, one that is full of opportunities, grace, and divine abundance. But stepping into this new beginning requires trust. Trust in God's plan. Trust that He will provide. Trust that He has already prepared the way for us, even when we cannot see it. I want to remind you that stepping into your 8th day is not about striving or pushing harder. It's about surrendering your will to God's perfect plan, aligning yourself with His divine rhythm, and walking in obedience. The moment you step out of your own strength and into God's provision, you will begin to experience a life marked by peace, fulfillment, and unshakable joy. The eighth day is about transformation. It's about leaving behind the limitations of the past and embracing the fullness of the future God has for you. Let's not forget, the abundance we seek is not just in material things. It's in the restoration of our relationships, the healing of our minds, the peace of our hearts, and the clarity of our purpose. When we align with God's rhythm, we step into divine abundance in every area of our lives. But how do we live in this divine rhythm? It starts with faith, with believing that God will provide for us just as He did for Noah. It's about knowing that no matter the storms you may face, God has already gone ahead of you to prepare the way. The beauty of the eighth day is that it's available to you right now. It's not a distant hope, a future promise. It's a present reality that God wants you to experience today. When you align yourself with His plan, when you step into the rhythm of His divine provision, you will begin to see doors open that you never thought possible. The life you've always dreamed of is not just a faraway dream. It's waiting for you to step into it with faith and trust in God's provision. I understand that it's easy to get caught up in the hustle and bustle of life, to think that we need to do everything ourselves. But God's provision doesn't come from our own efforts alone. It comes from trusting Him, from surrendering our plans and our desires to His greater purpose. As you take that step of faith, I encourage you to reflect on the ways that God has already provided for you in your life. Take a moment to recognize His presence, His love, and His faithfulness. The more we acknowledge His provision, the more we open ourselves up to receive even greater blessings. If this message has touched your heart, if you feel that these words have brought light into your life or helped you find peace in a chaotic world, I invite you to join me in this journey of faith. Your support, whether through likes, comments, or subscribing, helps keep this message alive. Every small act of encouragement, every piece of energy you share, contributes to the continuation of this mission, to spread the word of God's love, provision, and grace. It's not about donations, but about being part of a community that seeks to uplift each other and walk in the fullness of God's promises. Your support, no matter how big or small, is deeply appreciated and valued. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this journey, for being a beacon of light, and for walking in faith with me. Together, we will continue to explore and embrace the divine rhythm that God has prepared for us. We are all in this together, and with each step, we move closer to the abundant life He has for us. Remember, the eighth day is not just a concept. It is the life God has already prepared for you. Step into it with faith, trust, and obedience. Trust that God is leading you into new beginnings, divine restoration, and unshakable provision. Let His blessings overflow into every area of your life. This is your time. Step into your eighth day and experience the fullness of His promises.